Hi, everybody. My name is Szodfridt. These are my two colleagues, Rohit Kelapure and Shaun Anderson. And our talk today is about buckets, funnels, mobs, and cats, or how we learn to love scaling to the cloud. If you ever saw the movie Dr. Strangelove, that was inspired by my title. Probably a lot of people here don't know anything I'm talking about because it's a very old movie, but that's kind of what we thought about when we made the title. So if it seems familiar, that's the reason for it. So the three of us work for Pivotal. We work in the application transformation group, and what we do is we take business critical applications and we transform them to the cloud. We've been doing this for about 5 years. We have tons of recipes and transformation patterns. I think the number currently is somewhere around 1,000 on the repeatable patterns that we've used to do these transformations, and we've done this for clients that are easily recognizable. So our story today is about Pete. Pete went to this great presentation last year, which is a shameless plug for our presentation from last year, which is Tools to Slay the Fire-Breathing Monoliths in Your Enterprise. And in that presentation, Pete saw this wheel of transformation that he was very intrigued by, and he wanted to try it out. So he learned about how to do event storming, to do bounded context definitions, how to model big systems. He learned about using OKRs to keep everything aligned from a strategic perspective. He learned about doing slice analysis and SnapE and Snap to figure out technical feasibility factors. They started working, he's assembled a small team, and he's been relatively successful so far. He's transformed about 15 or 20 apps to Cloud Foundry. They're doing pretty good on that end. They've also decided to start working on tearing down a monolith, and they've actually come up with about 5 or 6 or 7 microservices. So Pete and a small team are making pretty good strides, moving things to the cloud using this wheel of transformation that they learned about last year. Then one day, Pete's boss comes in to his office, CIO, and says, "Pete, can I see you in my office?" He sends him a message. Pete's like, "I don't know if I really like this attention from the CIO. He usually doesn't pay that much attention to me. He doesn't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing." He's a little nervous about going to this meeting. As the meeting day approaches, his palms are a little sweaty, his heart's beating a little faster, and he sits down in his office, and the CIO says, "Pete, you're doing a great job. You're doing a fantastic job. I want you to scale up your transformation efforts to one big business unit." Pete says to himself, "Oh snap, how am I going to do this?" He says, "How do I scale to one business unit? I have a small team, and we're working with a distinct set of applications. Everything's easy to control. How am I going to make this thing bigger? How do I maintain the agility that I have with my small team?" He says, "I better go talk to them, figure out what we're going to do." So they start doing what they always do. They start talking to people. They collaborate. Pete's team is lean, it's agile, they work through collaboration. They start talking to all the business owners about, okay, what applications should we work on? What's the business priority of the applications that you want to transform within your business unit? And they start making up a list. This rapidly starts to decline. Things are taking way too long to decide what order they should work on in the applications. There's too many business owners. What's a pretty large business unit, all the business owners have impact, everyone wants to be heard. It's getting difficult to assess what real value is. It's very subjective. Business owners all think that their application is more important than the other application, and it's a lot of conversation, it's a lot of mediation. They're trying to herd business owner cats here, and it's not working too well. It's very subjective, and like I said, they're having a tough time with the competing interests of everyone in the room. So their system, which worked really well when they're small, is rapidly turning into meeting hell, which is not what they want. So he talks to his team and says, "We need a way to prioritize these apps in the business portfolio in some systematic way other than just talking to people." So he asks his team, and Scott says, "We should align with strategic goals." That's a no-brainer, Scott. Thanks for that information, but that's good input. Moxie says, "We didn't score apps by business factors. We need to come up with something that says we could use some math to assess and evaluate the applications." And Becky says, "We have to create some kind of funnel so we could filter these applications and come up with a stream of apps to filter through the process." So they ask the CIO, "What are the strategic goals?" CIO says, top strategic goals, I want you to improve customer experience, improve agility, and a bunch of other things that I didn't fit on the slide." So Pete's team says, "All right, let's start brainstorming what we could use as business factors." They go in a big room, they get a whiteboard, they get a bunch of stickies, and they start brainstorming on business factors. They group them together by similarities, and then they write a new factor or business factor for each one of those piles of factors that they came up with. Then they put them on a big sheet of paper to further refine their decision-making process to say, well, here's some of that big pile that we could use. These are pretty good. Let's try those. And then they take another dive deeper and decide on which ones they will actually use, filtering their pile down even smaller. And then they put them in rank order to decide which ones are the most important. Now they feel really great. They have a set of business factors. And this is what they came up with. They said we're going to measure things against client experience of value, how much they impact its low financial risk, how competitive advantage it provides. Are we planning investment of time and money on those people? Does it provide value to other applications? A series of things that they could use to measure applications to see if they're valuable to give them a subjective score, or objective score rather. Then Moxie on the team says, guys, we're not going to do this funnel just once, are we? We're not doing big planning up front. And Scott says, yeah, what if priorities change in the future? We have to make this funnel where we can do this as many times as we want and have it accommodate any changing circumstances. We don't want to get into a giant roadmap where we're going to say, this is a specific order that you're going to do 1,000 applications in. So the team comes up with a way to priority weight their business factors. They have a set of business factors. They decided that they're going to stick to those business factors, but they're going to weight them so they can adjust the impact they have when they score the applications as needed. So whether that's a wave change, a different set of applications, or the strategic goals change, the money runs out, whatever it is, they want flexibility to be able to tune their funnel process. So they take those business factors, those weighted business factors, they put all their apps in a big chart, and they score them against their criteria. Does it correlate, strongly correlate, doesn't correlate? And that gives them a mathematical score, and they have a list of applications rated by their mathematical score on their business priority, based on their current set of factors and the needs of that time. So Pete's team is pretty happy with themselves. They created a funnel that can run multiple times, create waves of business factors, give them an order of priority, a prioritized list of business applications, and they have a funnel so far that they can tune the business factors on and adjust as needed. So Pete and his team are really happy right now.
All right. So what Pete's team started doing next is they took all the applications that had a business score and they started going through a process called SNAP. SNAP is something that we introduced last time, and it evaluates an application along a criteria of 30 technical questions, and it generates a technical feasibility score. So SNAP is basically a way of doing a technical feasibility assessment of moving an application to the cloud. Now remember, they are doing this for thousands of applications, all the applications in their portfolio. So Pete's team started complaining, saying that it's taking too much time. This is hard. There are simply too many apps here. We possibly can't go through and snap each application. Emily says, where is the strategic view? Technically, we had a strategic view from a business perspective. I don't see what's the strategy from a technology perspective. How do we know we are picking the right apps from a diversity perspective? Are we covering all the technologies, right? And will the solutions that we put forward, will they scale? Benjamin, who had a down day, saying, man, our apps are the worst. We're never going to get this done. And the CIO got wind of this and started thinking we are lost. Like, this team is lost in the forest of apps. And so this problem falls on Pete. Pete, what should we do? Pete then says, wait a minute, we need a way to calculate we need a quick way to calculate the technical feasibility score for apps. And then Emily has a bright idea. How about we group applications together, right? What we will do is that instead of single apps, we will snap a group of apps together. We will categorize those applications, right? That's the best way. If we can categorize the applications, then we can reduce our cognitive load by just dealing with groups of apps, right? And Jacob says, awesome, then we can extrapolate the score from the grouping, right? Organizing information has come from the dawn and evolution of humankind. So, kind of makes sense. So now, the task fell on to Mohan, the poor enterprise architect, who had to deal with all of the universe of the workloads on the Java stack. But To his rescue, Mohan quickly figured out a way to group apps into buckets. Now these buckets are seen here, and I will be giving a pop quiz at the end to make sure you guys remember as well. So I won't get into all of these buckets, but essentially the buckets of applications for all the Java workloads fell into a number of categories. On the extreme left are your stateless cloud-native applications that have been written with Spring Boot, with modern frameworks like Spring Framework, that are basically stateless, and those can be just run on Cloud Foundry. Those are easy, very, very easy to migrate. In fact, there may not be any work needed at all. So the technical feasibility score is very high. As you start going to the right, the picture starts getting bleaker and bleaker. From the stateless apps, you start wandering onto the stateful land of WebSphere and WebLogic, where transactional workloads rule and persistent file systems are needed to store your transaction logs. Some of the apps fell into buckets that were basically like web APIs or simple UIs. But the farther you go to the right, the more gnarly it became. One of the buckets was for ESB and BPM workflow applications. Those are difficult to move to the cloud without rewrite, and so they fall into their own category. And the last set of applications were applications that you have to completely rewrite. Things like thick Java clients will have to be written into single-page applications. And one of the applications that he left off and was reminded was mainframe. We also have a lot of mainframe extensions and native code, and Mohan was forced to kind of write that into this stack as well. Next, on the .NET side, while the architect was instructed to create these buckets, and on the .NET side, you can see the story is a lot cleaner because the workloads are a lot more homogeneous and the categorization is simpler. You have your .NET Core modern apps, which are cross-compiled and can run both on Linux and on Microsoft Windows servers. And as you go along, you get into the ASP.NET, ASP.NET MVC apps. The Windows service apps can be run as console applications. You have WCF services and workflow foundation in the second last bucket, which requires some amount of rewrite to run them on PCF. And the last is your thick clients or your Windows forms that will need some form of rewrite because you can't run WPF apps as is on PCF. These are like thick clients that will need to get rewritten. So the universe of applications was grouped into buckets on the Java side and on the .NET side. But that was not enough, because both Mohan and Weil felt that was just too high a level. We cannot snap all the apps, all the .NET Core apps in the same way. We need to get to a lower level of granularity, a higher level of granularity. And so they started coming up with patterns of interaction for their applications. Some applications are basically SOAP-to-SOAP data mappings. Some applications were just invocations of other web services. Some applications simply talk to a database. So they did a second order decomposition where they drove into the higher order, where they derived from the higher order buckets, lower order buckets. And these are the buckets they snapped and landed on a scale. Every application that landed in the bucket had the same score. And then they categorized the buckets on an axis of technical feasibility that you see in the bottom. So they had an understanding what their high-level buckets were, what their low-level buckets were, and what score each application has based on the bucket it fell into. Okay. So now, in addition to this, given that they started doing this a lot, they wrote an application called Snap, which allowed them to just easily answer and do the repeatable snap process for the buckets of applications. Over here, you can see that some of the questions of the snap and the score is at the top, which is a large score with a score of 2.29. So Snap is an application that allows you to ask those questions and record them in a systematic fashion. And then Steve wrote this tool called App Foundry that does snap in an automated fashion. It didn't do 100% of the snap, but got you there 80% of the way, right? So now I have my business factors. I have thousands of applications grouped by business factors. Each application has a technical feasibility score, allowing me to put them on a graph to figure out what are the most valuable applications to work on.
So at this point, Pete is pretty happy, but he knows he's got the feel for the feasibility of an application, but there's constraints, right? This next step. What does Pete do next? So as he starts thinking through this, he realizes, hey, this isn't the government. We have a budget, right? I can't just work on whatever we want to work on forever. And time is also not infinite, so not only do I have constraints around money, I have constraints around time. So how do I start prioritizing? And this is Pete's dilemma at this point. So the first thing that Pete starts thinking about is, well, there's different types of application flavors. When we're prioritizing, we're thinking about where to start, you have to think about where to finish. So from Pete's perspective, he starts thinking about Larry, who's his overly ambitious tech lead, who always wants to build everything completely from start to finish perfect, which of course doesn't fit into the big plan. Because sometimes you actually have to just stop, right? So there's different flavors of applications, starting with something that, hey, maybe we can just rehost something on Cloud Foundry that enables something more strategic as we're going through. So as we're going from left to right on this number line, Pete's starting to realize there's going to be some applications that we're actually going to want to rebuild completely, the mainframe apps. But we also want to rein in Larry in the cases where we just want to get it to run well to get more strategic use out of something downstream. So thinking through that different kinds of application flavors is helping Pete and his team realize that there's boundaries and it's forming kind of a bigger picture plan. And what this does then, excuse me, is it lets Pete and his team start thinking about let's take that scatter plot that we talked about, where we're measuring applications from technical feasibility. The highest feasible apps, the easiest ones to put on Cloud Foundry, are higher on this graph. And the applications that have the biggest business value are further to the right. And so this is helping think about how we want to invest time and money into this application space. But it's still pretty big, right? It's a pretty big space. So when Pete's thinking about how do I prioritize this, does that mean all of these get done? Does it mean some of them? Do I naturally start in the upper left because that's the easiest? Or do I want to start way over here on the bottom right because that's the highest value? So what Pete does, and I think it was Becky suggested putting quadrants up here. I can't remember. I think it was Becky. But on these quadrants, the two right-hand quadrants end up being the most value. So that's a good place to start and start thinking about our investments. But there's still a lot of busyness, a lot of applications that are part of that. So Mohan, being the architect, said, well, let's just take a viewport of this. Let's look at just a subset so we can start playing around and prioritize. And at this point, we're just modeling things relative to each other. And what this means is as we discuss and identify that this particular application is high value and easy to do, we can move things around. We can decide that different applications fit the mentality better. We have different ideas about business value, so forth. And this gives us the ability to start prioritizing this matrix. So as we're thinking through this, we're thinking in terms, Pete and his team are thinking in terms of, okay, we have a finite amount of money, we have a finite amount of time, so how are we gonna dole out and proportion our budgets of both time and money? What are we gonna spend time on most? In the bottom right-hand quadrant are things that are very high business value, but because they're low, that means they're fairly complex. There might be the mainframe application that's really running the business. They might be something that is, the old WebLogic, EJB, something very complex that we know is going to be technically difficult, but it's super high value. So we're going to want to budget a proportion of our money that's large, a large portion of money, and it's going to take a larger amount of relative time to accomplish fixing those. The upper left or the upper right-hand corner is, well, because they're higher on the graph, that tells us they're going to be easier to complete. And that means we're going to spend proportionally less time and less money than the lower right-hand quadrants. And then on the left-hand side, we'll see, especially the bottom left, it's like, well, those are fairly simple technically to accomplish, and they wouldn't take much time, but we don't want to allocate a whole lot of time down here because there's really not a lot of business value compared to the other ones. In the upper left quadrant, yeah, it's going to take a little bit of our money, but we don't want to certainly tell Frank, hey, start working on this guy because it's technically easy, and Frank wants to take it all the way through to the end. We want to just say, do something good enough so we can enable and focus on these pieces. But the other thing that this does is it gets Larry and Pete thinking about, what do we do to make sure we add value? We don't necessarily want to think in terms of let's just work on one of these high value, high complexity and run out of money and run out of time. So we start thinking in terms now of let's map these to our number line. So we realize that when Pete was talking about, hey, some of these high technical feasibility, those are fitting really in that replatforming world where we can do a minimum amount of work to get the maximum business value. And that helps understand that, hey, let's allocate some time to this, but not the largest proportion of our time and money available. The applications that fit in the lower right-hand quadrant those are more refactor, rebuild. So those are becoming very strategic applications. Maybe we're not ready to to jump into those until we do some learnings with some of the rehosting on the upper left-hand quadrant. So now Pete has this idea that we have this mapping. Let's do an arc. Let's start talking about our phase one. So when we are looking from Pete's perspective at what do we actually do first, this is where the discussions come about where, Larry wants to do everything to the highest value, right? Let's make everything 12-factor compliant, 15-factor compliant, and make it perfect. But the rest of the team says, you know what, I think we need to do something that starts with, it's a easy tech feasibility and adds some business value, but that's going to be important to get a win. We get something out the door. We actually have a result, and that'll inform the other applications. So again, this trying to decide which phases we're going to be working on, Pete's thinking, well, we know we have X amount of time and X amount of budget. Just we're guessing, not waterfall type guess, but we're saying prioritization wise, we want to pick these particular applications to start for phase one. And that will help inform us then as we go further to phase two. And this becomes just ripples on this graph. And if you remember, this is a viewport. There's hundreds of applications, but the approach here is constructive laziness, where Pete is saying, I don't really want to analyze everything. Let's just pick what is the most important and eliminate the rest. And as we go through each step of the way, each phase, we can reprioritize based on what we've learned. And everybody seems to think, hey, that's a pretty good plan. And it's also pretty easy to represent to the executives, right? Here's the applications we're doing first, and here's why. So at this point, now Pete is pretty excited because they've gone through the funneling process. The business factors are informing what is important from a business perspective and how easy or hard they are based on our tech feasibility for the buckets. And now we have an idea of where to invest our money and time. Is it the upper right-hand quadrants? We use the arc to determine what should be in the first phase and what shouldn't. So Pete's fairly happy at this point. Now we also are able to understand where the time and money is going to be spent and best spent. And being an agile team, Pete's team realizes that things can adjust over time and that should be okay, but at least it's a starting point that is probably mostly correct from Pete's perspective. So he's happy for now.
So Pete is happy. His team's happy. They're moving along. They have their funnel. They're using their matrix prioritization to figure out where they should spend time and money. They're creating multiple waves of prioritized lists based on business factors, technical factors, plus a little bit of thought and science or math in the area of prioritization in terms of strategic value versus business value. So at the team meeting he has about a week later, he sees a bunch of sad faces and he doesn't quite know why. So he asks Becky, what's going on? She says, people are starting to question the sequence of apps, Pete. I'm getting a lot of feedback when I tell the business owners that we want to work on this app. Scott says the business owners don't want to work with us. They're busy. They have priorities. They have features they have to get out the door. They don't want to commit people to work on this transformation project. And Moxie says, you know, guys, I get this weird feeling that we're just blindly following the machine. It's like when I'm going somewhere with Waze and it says exit here and I know I shouldn't, but I do it anyway. I'm not comfortable with this anymore, right? And Scott says, yeah, and there's a lot of things that people keep bringing up about our selection process that seem to make sense that I don't think we're accounting for. So what's happening is they're starting to lose faith. They spent a lot of time building this scientific model, math. They put a lot of thought into it, got a lot of nice visuals, and they're starting to doubt their own creation. They're starting to think that the machine that they've created is giving them the wrong information. So they have to come up with some new ideas on how do they account for these factors that they don't have built into their funnel that just seem to be popping up here and there. So he asks his team again, and Mary says, let's add another dimension to the funnel. Moxie says, whoa, that seems way too complicated. We already put a lot of thought into this. I think we should try something simpler. So Scott says, yeah, what about stickies? And let's just think about it. Let's just go back to the stuff we used to do in the old days. So they said, that's a good idea. They go into a big room, they get a big whiteboard, they take the output of their matrix prioritization, and they list out the quadrants, and they list out the apps they have, and they just start looking at them, talking about what's going on, and trying to come up with just some of these factors to discuss which order they should tune this funnel output from. They'd look at this one app and say, we should move this up because this builds confidence. There's a bunch of people who don't really believe we know what we're doing or that we can do this. This is a great app that would show people in that business unit that we're competent and this is possible. So let's move that up in priority. They look at another app, and this is the app that Scott said that product owner doesn't want anything to do with us because they're so against the wall and they're way behind the deadlines on feature delivery that they're not going to give us any people to work with, so let's just move that down. They look at another pattern, and it's way over in the lower priority area where they shouldn't spend a lot of time and money. But that application there, Moxie says, this is like 90% of what we do in this business unit. If we solve this problem, we have patterns for a huge swath of applications. So let's move that one up in priority. All right, and then Scott says, I don't want to work on this app over here because I've been talking to those people, and they're in Brazil, Spain, Mexico, and Texas. And they're so far apart, they can't even work together. We can't touch that. That is not a good one. Let's just take that off the list for right now. And then Pete says, okay, well, while we're taking things off the list, the business owner in this group, he is not friendly. He does not agree with this transformation business at all. If we move one of his apps up in priority, he's going to torpedo the whole thing. So let's just don't even deal with it. So they're feeling pretty good. Now they had some sense, some mind, some thinking they put into this. They call these things human factors, just because they needed a new term, so they called them human factors. And they had a couple of them, right, that they had developed confidence in business. That's good. That's something to move up in priority. Things where the team's not friendly, maybe we move that down a little bit. It solves a lot of use cases as a positive. Geographic distribution could go either way. If they're really close, maybe that's something you move up in priority. If they're really far apart, maybe you move down. But if they're really far apart, but they know how to work in pairs, maybe you move back up. So that's all over the place. And generating representative recipes and patterns is always a good thing, especially in the beginning of the transformation phases. So they're feeling pretty good. They're putting brain power into this. They got some factors. They're looking at the prioritization matrix. And with that, they create a backlog from their mathematical model that's hand-tuned to adjust for the factors that aren't so, they're kind of touchy-feely, they're not so scientific, and they're feeling pretty good. Someone jokingly says, this is like reverse AI. We're actually thinking. So from then on, the team jokingly refers to this thinking process as reverse AI. So at this point, they have the sophisticated funnel that does business factors and technical feasibility measurements. They have two matrices that tell them what apps are worth working on, and another sophisticated, from their perspective, prioritization matrix that tells them how much time and money is worth to invest relative to the other applications they have. And they've come up with this really cool reverse AI maneuver to cover all the things that they didn't think of before that they could do very easily just by thinking. Again, Pete's team's happy again.
So, as Pete's history shows, every time he's successful, he gets punished by getting more responsibility. So, Pete's boss at this point says, "Great job, do the same thing, but now for 3 business units." And so Pete, of course, goes back to his team and says, "Okay, now what? We can't do this sequentially. We've tried that each step of the way. We see the same patterns. We do it sequentially. We have to expand the snap into buckets. And what can we do that kind of fits that same mold?" We also have dev teams that span our business units. So we have a problem with just even getting people up to speed. They might be in Mexico and Texas, but they're also part of different teams. So how do I ramp up the team? So I can't do it sequentially. I need to ramp up teams. Now what do we do? And so scaling, well, we have right now the business unit funnel. So we have expertise in how do we do this for one business unit. We've got the funnel that goes through some sort of program decision. In the case of Pete's previous experience, he knows that this kind of decision making usually generates things like time, budget, cost. Any of those decisions help inform what your core team should be. So Pete says, well, we have a core team right now. With that core team, we've done mob programming or pair programming. Basically, we're smart enough to realize that, hey, there's so much stuff here to learn that we're going to do it together. We're going to pair up. We're going to do it as a team. So the end result should be that our mob is not single focused. It's not we have one expert in WebLogic and Larry, who's the cross pollinator, decides, hey, let's make sure everybody is pretty good at everything. And those people then become the pathfinders. So the first team with Larry and Becky and Mohan, those are the pathfinders now that can start seeding these development teams. They form the development teams out of that. And so the thought is, well, this is kind of a repeatable process. If we start thinking in terms of parallel business units, each business unit now has its own funnel, following the same process that was fairly well defined, that's gone through a couple times. There may be different program decisions based on the leader of that particular business unit, but in the end, it's the same thing. There's certain budgets, there's certain time constraints, team constraints, but now these pathfinders can be spread across each of the different teams. So we have a set of new pathfinders that's seeded with one of the previous pathfinders, and they start forming the leadership team or the technical teams for these other funnels and these other business units. And then that, of course, creates new development teams, and pretty soon they start reproducing exactly like a virus or cell division. It's team mitosis. So pretty quickly, we've gone from one team, one business unit, to now 2, and then 4, and then 8, and 16, and 32, and so forth. But the more iterations you have, the more team comes up to speed. And that's keeping Pete pretty happy again at this point. So something as simple as just applying the same process that we've done from both the technical prospect, the funnels, and the buckets, thinking through the business factor and the tech feasibility, Pete's realized that we can follow that same approach even with the teams and start thinking about how do we do that reverse AI. We understand what the team structure should be, where the pitfalls are, where the bodies are buried, and then from that we can start scaling this out. And so within each one of these little iterations, we're going through the same business factor, tech feasibility, prioritization, and reverse AI, and now they're really humming. We think.
Right. So then the CIO comes back and asks Pete, hey Pete, are business units maintaining consistency and quality? Are developers being productive with this new funnel factory approach that we have created? Are the applications landing on the platform? How many apps do we have in production, Pete, across all our business units? Are we really succeeding with this transformation? is this working? And so the CIO has an existential crisis. How do I measure transformation? Like, is this successful? And so Pete comes back to his team and says, guys, if we can't measure it, we are not going to be able to improve it. And this is not coming from Pete. He read it up from Peter Drucker. So that's the source of this quote. And so now he has a bright team, right? Mohan says, hey, let's make sure that our developers can get onboarded very quickly, and let's measure that. Let's measure onboarding time. How long does it take for a developer to get onto the platform and push an app, right? Emily, who came from the startup world, says, hey, this Pivotal Cloud Foundry, developers use it day in, day out, all the time to push apps to the platform. And so the engagement metrics that apply in the consumer world should apply to our world as well. Why don't we measure daily active developers and monthly active developers and chart a power curve? That makes sense. And finally, Becky says, let's create these journey markers so that we know how far along are we on this journey. So those look like good ideas. And so the team puts together this chart of all the metrics and markers that they want to measure. A lot of this gets synthesized in terms of number of apps running in production, but then it breaks down along how long does it take for an app or a user to be onboarded onto the platform. What is the lead time for a feature to go from idea to production across all the release gates? And then downstream, the metrics that they start tracking is engagement with the platform, engagement of developers. If the core team has been created, have recipes been created, the number of recipes created, and so on. So these are a collection of all your journey markers. Metrics, KPIs, whatever you want to call it, that Pete's team suggests that this will give us an idea of how to measure transformation. Are we succeeding with transformation? And so they start tracking these journey markers. And for each kind of marker, there are phases along which the business unit has made progress. Some of the markers are kind of squishy, whereas the other markers, we measure them properly. We have established processes for it. And green is we are continuously measuring them to improve that statistic. So the markers, so we define our markers, and we are at various stages in our journey to collect those markers and to institutionalize them. Okay, so our teams have scaled to business units. The business we have now defined journey markers to understand if the specific business unit is succeeding with transformation, right? So we have figured out how to measure transformation. Now that we have started measuring transformation, there is a problem. Our metrics are going down, right? We are not deploying as frequently as we should be, right? We can't seem to, our lead time for pushing features is 4 months. And we have a high failure rate for the features we do push out. This leads to the realization for the CIO that they have in effect implemented ITIL on PCF for this particular business unit, right? And the chart that you see in the background is actually the wall of ITIL, the process as it's defined today, right? So there's something we need to do about this, right? So Pete, again, gets tasked to solve that. And Pete is a big believer in the theory of constraints from Eli Goldratt. He's like, we need to expose the pain in the system. We need to surface the top constraints. And so how do you do that? He expects his team to come up with ideas. And Becky says, how about we do a value stream mapping exercise, which makes sense. It maps all the software development life cycle on a canvas. We need to eliminate our top process blockers so that we can improve flow in the system. And lastly, how about we create a cross-functional team of both developers, testers, release managers, platform architects, platform engineers, network guys, so that the flow is streamlined. And so the last suggestion was, hey, how about we use automation to to do as much as possible to push apps on the platform without inserting gates or as much automation as possible. So pipeline everything. And the way to do this is they charted, they did an exercise called value stream mapping, where they mapped their entire software development cycle along all their phases and took a particular app and figured out how long does it take for that app to get to production. And not only did they do this for one app, they did it for 2 or 3 apps and realized that the cycle times vary. For some apps, it's 20 days. For small features, it's more like 45 days. And for big features, it's 63 days. And so this was the tracer bullet that they sent across to measure those times. And what did they find is that all of the manual scripting, the manual creation of environments takes time, right? They need a strategy for automated QA. What they discovered is that they needed templated CI/CD pipelines for automated onboarding. And then, so once they have surfaced the pain and they came up with the ideas,
so I'm going to go back one here. So you're probably wondering what happened to Pete, but we kind of gave it away. But this is where Pete's supposed to have another problem, but this is not where he has a problem anymore. At this point in time, Pete and his team are doing really well, and they get a big raise because they figured this stuff out. They're transforming. They scaled across multiple business units. They're rewarded wisely and very well for their efforts. CIO says, hey, Pete, you and I, next year, we're doing a talk on this on the main stage at Spring 1 2019, so get ready. So Pete says, whoa, that's awesome. I'm not even worried about it because we got this stuff covered. What are we going to talk about? And well, Pete, we're going to talk about how you and your team built a funnel that can assess business factors and technical feasibility and chart those out on a scale, and how you created buckets so you can do the technical feasibility quicker, how you can continually adjust your business factors so they don't go stale, how you're creating waves of applications so you're not doing big planning up front, and then you're going to talk about how you use that information to figure out which applications you should invest time in, which ones are valuable for you. And then you're going to talk about that matrix prioritization thing you're doing, where you figure out, okay, if we have a limited amount of time and money, of the applications that make sense to work on, how should we distribute our time, money, and effort? And how did you control the people that are working for you not to take every app and make it 12-factor? Because that's what the developers always want to do. Then you're going to tell them that crazy story about the reverse AI thing that I think you should just call think from now on because it sounds a little silly. But if you want to, that's okay. About how you tweaked and tuned the priorities to accommodate for the things that your machine, your funnel process wasn't giving you. Then I want you to talk about how you scaled out from one team to multiple, how you started with one funnel, split that into 2 funnels, ramped up multiple business units, because that is really interesting on how successful you're able to do that. Then I don't want to show them our journey markers. Well, wait, hold off on that. Maybe if they're good, we will. If they're not, we may just want to fake that a little bit. But I want you to talk about how we measured our success, how we measured our path, and finally, how we use that sticky thing with the stickies on the whiteboard to map out the events and the value stream to identify where our problems are. I really like that because you didn't do a whole lot of time and you got it done really quickly. I want to talk about this entire process, so make sure this thing works. And oh, by the way, you got 3 business units now. By the time we have this talk, you better have it working for 5. And that's our talk. Thank you very much. We have some time for some questions if anyone has some. Could you say that again a little louder, please?
So, even for one business unit, you have each team which controls the onboarding of many applications to the cloud. Don't you think each team is the bottleneck for cloud adoption in large enterprises?
So if I'm hearing your question correctly, constraining it to one business unit is creating bottlenecks in moving everything?
He's asking if Pete's team itself is a bottleneck.
Oh, yes, Pete's team could become a bottleneck. That's why they realized early on that he has to create, when they're doing the mob programming, that he has to create multiple core teams. So every time he's getting larger, he's taking his existing team of pathfinders and he's creating more and more pathfinder teams. And if we go back to for up here, example, he's spawning up new teams in each one of these business funnels. So as his team becomes a constraint, he's making more. And Pete's role actually ends up being more at this level, at a higher level of program decision, where they're making strategic decisions on what the business units and what the core teams are scaling out to. So yes, very, very dangerous. You could definitely become a bottleneck, but they figured it out. Any other questions?
What are the difference between rehost and the platform? Does rehost means changing from legacy to the general content?
So in this case, rehost may be using a container like it already exists. So rehosting it on PKS, for example. So not even replatforming, meaning you make changes to it to be able to fit on PAS with the build pack. It's rehosted, just blob it up like it exists today and throw it up there without any changes from an application perspective.
Make zero changes to the application.
Right.
That's the idea of rehost. And just put it in a container, run it on PKS.
Okay, so we hosted, in the hosted, we do not break down the huge application to
Smaller services.
Right. It may be a monolith of some sort, and it may have, operating system constraints or file system constraints that make it so it's less feasible to go, or maybe it's really easy to just containerize, or it's already in a Docker container, for example. That makes it fairly simple to put up, but there's trade-offs, of course.
If you do have the big application, which is strategic, you could do the refactor, and refactor is where you're breaking it down into smaller services.
But also keep in mind, it's a strategy for applications that are somewhere down here where you don't think that their business value is all that high and their technical feasibility is high or low, but you decide that you don't want to spend a lot of time and money on it. So at that particular time, so you can just rehost it to get the benefits that come from being on Cloud Foundry without spending the money. So the key thing in this matrix prioritization is not that they end up that you should rebuild this, it's where you should spend the money and time that you have budgeted. Okay. All right, anything else?
So when you guys engage with a new client, are you guys Pete or are you training Pete at engagements?
We train Pete at the engagement, right? So we are not anybody's IT department. So Pivotal, we take the knowledge that you see up here is not Shaun, Rohit's, and mine. This is a collective of the 50 great, really smarter people than us that we work with that we've done multiple engagements on. And this is the current state of it. So we've had many versions of funnels. We've had many versions of reverse AI, human thinking, right? So this is a collective. And our role is to help clients learn all these things so they could scale out. And then we learn from them. But our mission is to help clients do this.
That's awesome. Are you working with partners in that as well?
We're building an ecosystem of partners to help in this, especially in this area here. So what we're really good at as Pivotal is we're really good right here. We're a small group. We only have about 50, 55 people in app transformation, so we can't support a lot of this scaling. So we're working with partners to help us fold them into this process so they understand what we're doing and help build out the scale when clients want scale. Because there's different things. Some people want to transform just because they need to get applications over to the platform, and they need a lot of brain power or body power to do that. So yeah.
I give you my chart.
Absolutely.
So what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on where you don't move the whole application, right? You're not replatforming or refactoring the whole application, where you're taking parts of the application where applying something like Strangler patterns, where you take pieces of the apps and then kind of move them on the new platform. So how do you, a lot of metrics that I looked at is you're taking the whole app, right? You're considering the whole app, but in more pragmatic sense, that might not be possible that you don't move the whole app. You kind of remove pieces of it.
Yes. So depending on how strategic the application is, what's the feasibility score? So that's exactly the right thing to do, is refactor it into smaller microservices. So if you see on the spectrum there, the big circle on the right over there is the circle of modernization. There we work with a lot of our customers to break applications down. The metrics apply both to large apps and to small apps. Onboarding affects not only the large application but small application. Developer engagement applies to both. So the journey health markers are really agnostic of apps themselves. They apply to any app, big or small.
And another point too is that I think it was Mohan who said it. I don't know.
Yeah,
Mohan
he was
appeared
the
a lot in the
architect.
story today.
Yeah.
So it's probably Mohan that when you're doing this funnel, this is not big upfront planning, that you rerun this. These are multiple waves. So you rerun this funnel multiple times. So if you're doing a monolith and you're over here in rebuild, then a piece of it goes through the funnel initially and says, we need to invest a lot of time and money on this. And then you break it apart. The remaining piece of that monolith would go back into the funnel and it would get assessed again in future waves to determine, okay, maybe we've done enough breakdown on this monolith that we could leave it alone right now because based on our matrix prioritization, there's better applications to invest our time and money in. And then maybe 2 quarters from now, as that cycles through that funnel again, the monolith says, no, we should invest time and money, and you start breaking it off. So every time you break it a little piece off, it goes back through the funnel. Everything you've left out in the previous wave goes back in the subsequent waves of the funnel.
For technical feasibility analysis, I just heard a video from somebody from Turkey that you guys are coming up with a tool that will look at the application code and spit out a score. Can you share about the tool?
Yeah, the tool is called App Foundry. It's currently in active development right now. We haven't released it to the public, but it's something that we use when we work with our customers or partners to understand the feasibility of the application. As with any of the source code scanners, it gets you maybe 40, 50, 60% of the way. And then the other app that I showed you, the Snap application, gets you to 100%. So the score is a combination of both like human Q&A and then there's an automated aspect to it to better inform your decision.
And one thing that's difficult with a tool like that is it doesn't take the place of some of the intelligence that people have, like what you were talking about with, it's a monolith, right? Like you run a big giant blob of COBOL code through it, it's going to just tell you, yeah, it's an extra large, it's really difficult, it's low on the technical feasibility. But as we start breaking out that monolith and thinking of new designs, then those components become much higher in the technical feasibility. And then over time, that monolith, as it's being strangled off, as you cycle through it again, it's going to be easier and easier to re-platform or change as you're going through as well.
For the system of system kind of apps, the huge apps, this tool is, I would say, of limited use because
for now.
Because now because the app itself is made up of 15 other smaller apps, so the tool doesn't have that kind of intelligence to figure out what the smaller service is. You need to go through a set of other exercises to break it down.
Certainly, you guys have a ton of like arbitrary intelligence in this you share with your clients. I see a lot of similarities in the same the Agile framework in this too, kind of like implicit. Is it? Do you guys have like a flavor of Agile or a thought like explicitly to Agile when you're doing this?
So Pivotal ourselves, we're very XP oriented and lean, right? So XP, we try to do a lot of test-driven development. Do that first. A lot of pair programming. We really believe in lean. So from our perspective, lean is to make an assumption, start with a small experiment, and always make your decision based on evidence, right? So that's our flavor. When we go to customers, they have their own flavors, and it's not really, even though we're very opinionated on how we should work, we're not going to tell them you should change the way you work. We try to influence them by the way that we work. But the main tenets that we have literally are from a lower level technical perspective, it's XP, and from a larger picture perspective, it's more lean about building assumptions, experiments, and making decisions on validated learning.
Items within a specific quadrant of the matrix, for instance, the quadrant 2.
I think Shaun was talking about those waves.
Yeah, so when if you remember the picture with the arc, as we're talking through what should be done first, sometimes the prioritization might be, as we're discussing, that the easiest one, the most technically feasible should be done first. But if that doesn't add any business value, then we shouldn't we shouldn't do that. But ultimately, it just becomes part of the assumptions again. So if we assume that let's pick the top upper left as one of our simple ones, as a way to kind of blaze the trail and find all the problems that during that path to deployment. All things being equal, that probably is fine. And as we're building that out, if we realize there were assumptions that were wrong, then we just change that and we pick a different one.
The way the matrix gives you information on where things lie relative to each other, and the wave gives you an idea of what the sequence should be. And what we found to be the most successful is in those first initial waves, especially, you have a really good distribution of highly technically feasible apps and ones that are a little harder. So you don't want to just do easy ones. You don't want to do just hard ones. You want to get a distribution. And when you draw that ripple, like Shaun was saying, you drop a pebble in the water and you draw the ripple through that matrix, it gives you a distribution to make sure that you're covering simple ones, hard ones, and especially in the very beginning, you're getting a really good distribution, more so than driving business value. But the idea is that you can tune that and adjust that based on whatever your strategic goals are at the time. Okay.
How do you think this decision-making process will differ for PKS as it's moving out?
So before we have in this funnel, we actually, where we're implementing customers, we actually have almost think of it as an emergency room triage section where we have things that are pure PKS candidates before they even get to the funnel. So we've simplified the funnel here, but depending upon the nature of the business and your applications, there's different layers. There's different kind of huge filters up front where you take 1,000 apps and you say they're totally PKS oriented because they're running the business. We're not going to change them or whatever reason. We just need them moved over because we're trying to save a licensing cost on something, for example. So those just go in the PKS bucket. We don't even put them through this funnel. And then everything else that we need to spend more time on replatforming, rebuilding, then we put those through the funnel to decide that. So
it may also happen that, there's an initial set of disqualifiers or qualifiers for PKS. It may also happen that at the end you figure out that you do want to rehost some applications, especially on 3 and 4. And so you may look at containerization as an option there as well. So it happens in the very beginning and then at this point as well.
Yeah, so all these answers we've been giving you, what it really amounts to is you can't skip this part. We joke about this, but you can't skip that part. All these tools just give you information, and no matter what information they give you, you still have to think about what you're doing. It's just a way for you to visualize the landscape, so you're not, as Rohit saying, you're not lost in the forest, right? This is just a way to show you what you have so you can think about what you should be doing and make intelligent, validated, informed decisions. Okay, anything else? All right,
Awesome.
thanks for coming.
Thank you.
We appreciate
Thank you.
it.